When you think about an eldest child, you usually think about a child who embodies all the goals and ideologies of their parents. They're kind of like a tiny little adult. And if you add a bunch of little kids in the mix, you definitely get that quintessential child that just wants to make their parents happy and protect their little siblings. That's exactly what we're going to talk about with Shari Franke as we talk about part one of The House of My Mother. So, in case you haven't been with us for the last 2 weeks, we've been digging into the scandal with Ruby Franke, her business partner, Jody Hildebrandt, and just the mayhem that kind of followed with that. So, we started reading a book written by Ruby Franke's daughter, Shari Franke. She is the eldest daughter, and in her book, The House of My Mother, she kind of accounts for what it was like growing up under the rule of somebody like Ruby Franke. So we started with part one. So part one is going to be chapters 1 through 7. I'm going to break each of those down, or at least my opinion on each of those down as I read through. So if you see me looking off to the side, it's just me looking at my notes. I figured it'd be fun to kind of discuss that. In keeping with that protective instinct of an eldest child, throughout the book, Shari will only refer to her brother Chad by name. The youngest of her siblings, she actually doesn't use their name, and that's her way of defending them. You can really see that she wants to minimize the harm that has already come to them. So, in the introduction of the book, Shari goes into getting that phone call from her neighbor when everything went down with her youngest siblings with the arrest. She also discloses at that point that she had been estranged from her mother for a year, and that was because her mom disowned her. As she gets into chapter one, she describes what Ruby's life was like. She kind of talks about how there were specific demands or specific expectations placed on Ruby as a child, just growing up in her household and within their LDS faith. She also gets into how when Ruby decided to go to college, she definitely was not there for an education. She had one specific goal in mind, and that goal was to find her husband so that she could fulfill what she felt was her spiritual mission. Shari says that Ruby felt that becoming a mother was a spiritual calling of the highest order. And you definitely see that. So, as I said, when Ruby went to college, she was on a mission to find a man. And when she found Kevin, she knew that she had found the right one for her because he was so laid back. In the book, Shari describes this by saying, Ruby had no interest in power struggles after all. What she needed was someone relaxed enough to let her take the reins without too much resistance. Sherry goes on to describe basically how Ruby kind of had a perfectionist mentality, but to the extreme. One of the ways she describes that is talking about Ruby's endeavors playing the piano. Sherry describes Ruby's take on piano playing by saying, playing the piano wasn't about fun, it was about excelling. Ruby's entire self worth was built on exceptionalism. So if she couldn't be extraordinary, then what was the point? So you can see in chapter one, Cher's really laying the foundation to describe what Ruby was like growing up and like Ruby's ideology. You can tell that Ruby's upbringing involved her own parentification, so it's not a far stretch to see that she really laid those same expectations onto Sherry. Moving on to chapter two, Sherry goes on to describe being born into the Frankie family as the first child. I'm sure Ruby had a lot of expectations of what that first child was going to be like. I think we all have kind of this weird expectation that our children are going to be born perfect, and that just doesn't happen. And this was kind of the case with Ruby and Sherry. Sherry actually, as an infant, started to show signs of discomfort and lots of crying and rejecting her bottles. After taking her to the doctor, they discovered that she actually had a life threatening intestinal blockage. Moving forward, you can kind of see that Sherry's laying that foundation for not quite meeting Ruby's expectations, even as an infant. Time out. Before we move on, I want to make sure that I invite you guys to hit the like button. I also want to remind you guys, if you have friends that love true crime or just would be interested in the story of triumph and story of perseverance and of resilience, then please encourage them to subscribe and go on this journey with us. Okay, back to the story. In chapter 3, Sherry describes Ruby's first forte into the internet and the world of social media. So back then, it was more blogger based, and that's exactly where Ruby began. He had a blog that's actually still up, and it was called Good Looking Home Cooking. I will put a little screenshot in there, and I'll put a link in the description below. Maybe you might want to do some of Ruby's recipes. And actually, Sherry mentions in the book that those recipes are more inspirational than necessarily done by Ruby. Sherry mentions Ruby and her blog and kind of not exactly making all those recipes. She says Ruby was willing to sacrifice authenticity on the altar of appearances. So you can kind of tell that for Ruby, she was already getting into that performative nature for the internet. Along with talking about Ruby's intro into the world of social media, Sherry also begins to describe some of Ruby's abusive tendencies. She talks about not really feeling like it was okay for her to emote, although Ruby was able to. She says, I rarely cried when Ruby punished me. Only one person in this house was allowed to shed tears, and it wasn't me. Moving on to chapter 4, Sherry begins to kind of get into the dynamics with Ruby and her mother, Sherry's grandmother, and how it began to sink in to Sherry that she and her mom weren't going to have that fairy tale mother daughter relationship, at least not while Sherry was a child. Sherry recounts a scenario where one of her younger siblings was born and her grandmother came, maybe it was to the hospital, but she came and presented Ruby with this beautiful pair of silk pajamas. And she talks about how she felt something inside, and it was jealousy. Not jealousy for the gift, but jealousy for the relationship and the love and the exchange that they were having because it was such a beautiful moment. She said that after she witnessed that, she went to Ruby and she was like, oh, when I have a baby, are you going to bring me silk pajamas? And Ruby basically said, that's right. When you have a baby, we can be friends. The most heartbreaking part of Sherry telling that story for me was that Sherry mentions that after that conversation, it really sunk into her that she would have to wait to be loved by her mother. So in chapter 6, Sherry gets in deeper to that whole abusive part of Ruby and talks about a physical abuse situation. Ruby really wanted Sherry to be proficient at playing piano, just like she had wanted to be. And even though Sherry wasn't always the most interested, she acquiesced, being that first child. And there was a scenario where Ruby asked her to play a duet with her and she expected Sherry to sing, but Sherry didn't feel like singing at the moment. And Ruby was like, maybe I should slap you. Now, there was a little bit more context to that, but that was the gist of it. And then Sherry goes into detail about when her mom slapped her. Sherry says, Ruby's hand would always find its way to my face, the sharp sting of displeasure delivered with precision. Her slaps were calibrated, never hard enough to leave visible bruises, at least not on me, but always sharp enough to instill fear. I can't even imagine being a child trying to perform the complicated task of playing piano, let alone playing piano and singing, and then having your mother standing over you, threatening to slap you, and just the anxiety that that must have created in her. Sherry goes on to explain that she really felt like her and her siblings were kind of punching bags for her mother, not literally punching bags. I don't think that Sherry is going to talk about Ruby punching the kids. I know that Kevin has mentioned that there had never been any physical abuse that he was aware of, but she does say that her mom always seemed to be a lot calmer after she blew off steam on them. So, in the last part of part 1, which is chapter 7, Sherry goes into some of the activities they had as kids and describing their home life. This is kind of her in her preteen era, right? So, she talks about what their first house was like, how all the kids would gather and do their homework at the kitchen table. And she says that they really didn't have a lot of activities, but one of the things that they enjoyed doing as a family was like watching movies, and how Harry Potter was one of the favorites of the family. She had her own characters that she really resonated with and liked to see, but she said Ruby's favorite scene from the movie was when Dumbledore decides to use a forbidden spell and says, "Being me has its privileges." So, as Sherry describes how much Ruby loved that quote, she felt like Ruby identified with that so much because she felt like she was above the rules as well. So, wrapping up chapter 7, you really get a sense that Sherry was really longing for that connection with her mother and also acutely aware that she was never going to get it. Sherry says Ruby maintained a strict emotional distance as if affection might somehow compromise her authority. So basically, part 1 was all about getting into not only Sherry's history as her early childhood, we went all the way through, up to her preteen years, but she kind of got into Ruby and how from day one, basically, of adulthood, her whole goal was to become this mother figure, to make tiny little humans who would look up to her and adore her, and basically make people that were going to be subservient to her so that she could sit on that pedestal. I'm really interested to know what you guys think of that first part. It'll be interesting to see the rest of the book. Even though we're only heading into part 2, we can already see that Sherry is an extraordinary young lady. She's really self aware. You can tell that she's done a lot of work to kind of unravel this situation. She talks a lot about journaling. I'm sure that aided in her kind of like really honing in on the feelings that she had regarding her mother and this whole situation. I'm curious to know what you guys thought about. I know as I read it, a lot of things resonated with me just because of my childhood. So I hope that none of us had a mom like Ruby. I know that no one's childhood is perfect. And if you did have some distress or stress in your childhood, I hope that reading this helps to give you some perspective on how we can move through this. And maybe we can use some of the tools that Sherry's used so that we can process and we can move on from these traumatic experiences. What do you guys think about the audacity of Ruby to have children just to have little servants? I have opinions, and we have speculations, and we'll keep talking about it. The next time we talk, we'll be moving on to part 2, so I'm looking forward to going through that with you. Thanks, guys.